So yes, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Improving Productivity in Central and Eastern European Countries. My name is Matthias Rumpf. I'm the Deputy Head of the OECD Berlin Centre, and I will guide you through this webinar this morning. The purpose of the webinar is not, primarily to present OECD findings. We will also present findings, of course, but is to have a discussion of our findings with the research community in the region, with the ambition to build closer ties among researchers and stakeholders. And we hope that eventually this will evolve into some sort of network where we will establish those exchanges on a more regular basis. This is the first of meetings we are planning to do in this regard, and we are very happy that you joined us this morning. I'm very pleased that we have three distinguished panelists today, and I will present them to you right now. We are having Martin Borowiecki. He's an economist at the OECD Economics Department, working on the desk of Hungary and Slovenia, and he will present in a minute findings on the topic of productivity from the OECD survey on Hungary. We are also joined by Balázs Reiser from the Center for Economic and Regional Studies at the Hungarian Academy of Science, and we're very much looking forward to his presentation or his talk or his comments as well. And we are joined by Zuzana Zawadzka from the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies in Austria. A few housekeeping remarks before we will open the meeting. This meeting, as you have seen, is going to be recorded, and we will share both the presentations of this morning and the recording on our blog at the OECD Berlin Centre. We will have, after the presentations, the room for discussions here in the plenary, and at 11:50, 11:55, we have prepared three breakout rooms with our panelists to continue the discussions on a more informal basis. So a small replacement for in-person discussions, which you might have over coffee. This time is only virtual coffee, but I hope we hope you will enjoy this as well. Before we start now with the presentations, I'm also very pleased that we are joined by Isabel Koske. She is the Deputy Director at the OECD Economics Department, and she will start our event today with a few opening remarks. So I'm very pleased to give the floor to Isabel Koske for her remarks.
Thank you, Matthias, for this quick introduction, and good morning to everyone also from my side, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm very happy that you've joined us to talk about how to improve productivity in Central and Eastern European countries. I think a very topical and very timely policy question. Today's seminar or webinar takes place against the background of low productivity growth in the region. Not only in the region, actually, we're observing low productivity growth in quite a couple of countries. But especially in the region, we see that productivity growth is too low to allow for fast income convergence with richer OECD economies. Strong productivity growth would also be needed to sustain growth in face of population aging, that is hitting the region as well as other countries. And obviously this leads to an old and also smaller workforce. And as such, demographic changes mean that the region's current growth model that relies very much on FDI, on low labor costs, and the mobilization of underutilized labor resources will become less sustainable. Looking ahead, future productivity growth must rely more on homegrown proper productivity growth. This webinar will therefore present the latest work by the OECD and Economic Research Institutes on productivity and discuss, the policy implications for Central and Eastern European countries. The starting point, as Matthias has said, will be discussion of the recently published 2021 Economic Survey of Hungary, which provides policy recommendations on how to strengthen productivity growth in Hungary. And then we will hear from Zuzana Zawadzka and Balázs Reiser what they think about these topics in light of their own research that they've done. Let me say that this seminar is meant to be the first of a series of seminars or webinars on selected economic issues within the region. And the aim is to have this seminar series and the related exchanges among participants eventually evolve into a research network. Let me now wish you all an interesting and fruitful webinar and hand over the word to my colleagues from the Hungary desk of the OECD to present their recent work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to start the webinar with the findings of the recently published OECD Economic Survey of Hungary, which provides recommendations to raise productivity growth. This is joint work from the Hungary desk, which was led by Jens Hoy, and also Federico Giovanelli, Laszlo Doza from the Ministry of Finance, me, and this was supervised by Mamfa too from the economics department. Let me share with you our findings about the main challenges for productivity. So you heard that levels of labor productivity are low in Hungary as well as in other countries of the region. And this poses a challenge for future income convergence with advanced economies. Apart from income convergence, low labor productivity is a challenge because stronger growth will be needed to sustain an older and smaller workforce. So demographic change makes it necessary to change the country's or the region's growth model away from a growth model that is based on low labor costs and the utilization and the mobilization of underutilized labor towards a growth model that is more productivity driven, homegrown productivity driven. And in our survey, we provide recommendations for Hungary, and they put emphasis basically on three issues, which first is skills, second is better labor allocation, and third is more competitive markets. Let me start with skills. We observed that, or we found that educational outcomes are weak, and they endanger the job prospects of many graduates in Hungary. For example, about half of all vocational education graduates work in unskilled jobs outside the occupation that they were trained for. And this reflects that educational outcomes are poorly matched to the labor market needs. Some countries have introduced, or some countries have strong apprenticeship systems that have a signal function. So basically, they align labor market needs to educational outcomes, so that schools can adjust their curricula and courses on what firms demand. In Hungary, the share of vocational education students in apprenticeships is relatively low. This is the same in other countries in the region. The vocational education system delivers still mainly traditional crafts and trade skills, whereas labor demand is shifting to a higher skilled jobs. This is the issue about skills. Another concern is that there are persistent pockets of high unemployment in poorer regions. At the same time, more prosperous regions face labor shortages. Stronger geographical mobility could help address this imbalance and raise labor productivity, but there are barriers to geographical mobility in Hungary. One is the rigid housing market. Most Hungarians live in their own homes, so in owner-occupied housing. And the government supports or government policies aim mainly at this owner-occupied housing. On the contrary, the private rental market is less developed and dominated by short-term rental contracts, which discourage geographical mobility. Another barrier to geographical mobility is the wage setting, and here in Hungary, that's mainly about the minimum wage. Minimum wages have risen faster than other wages, which discourages low-skilled people in poorer regions to look for better paid jobs elsewhere. And a third barrier is our commuting costs. And this reflects that local infrastructures are underdeveloped. So I'm talking mainly about local roads and local train networks. And against this background, the survey recommends to improve to better align educational outcomes with labor market needs by first linking funding for vocational schools to the number of students and work placements. Apprenticeships should be only started when work placement is secured, as is the case in countries like Germany. Stronger geographical mobility will require bigger rental markets, and this calls for more balanced rent regulation between tenants and landlords, regulations that encourage longer-term renting. And to lower commuting costs, more funding will be needed for road maintenance and investment in local train networks, always taking into account cost-benefit analysis. Another challenge for productivity in Hungary is to ensure dynamic and competitive markets. There is still a large difference between foreign-owned, capital-intensive companies that compete in the world markets and low productivity domestic firms. A major concern here is that is the weak business dynamics. Firm entry and firm exit have been weak in the recent decades, which points to potential competition issues. This has allowed low productivity firms to maintain disproportionately large market shares. So stronger business dynamics and more competitive markets are needed for a more efficient reallocation of capital and labor to more productive enterprises to break throughout this low productivity trap. With regards to competition, Hungary has a pro-competitive framework in place, but it could be more used. The competition authority is little active in those areas that have the highest danger of collusion, such as public procurement. This is despite the fact that the share of the public procurement with only one bidder is among the highest in the European Union in Hungary. There are also other areas of concern where competition is not allowed based on national security grounds. And finally, one issue we looked in the survey, or we identified, is that the digitalization is slow in Hungary, especially among smaller enterprises. One issue is that mobile broadband usage is low as compared to other countries in Europe, and this reflects high mobile internet prices. In general, low digital preparedness hampers the introduction of new technologies and the integration in global value chains. Against this background, the survey recommends to strengthen competition by reviewing all key mergers and accept from competition only on explicit public interest grounds, and to increase the share of public procurement subject to competitive tendering. In order to lower mobile internet prices, stronger competition will be needed in the telecommunication sector. And this calls for auctions to expand the number of mobile network operators. So this and many other recommendations can be found in the recently launched OECD Economic Survey of Hungary. And as Isabel pointed out at the beginning, this is the perspective of the OECD. And I would like to have some discussion about our recommendations, what we are missing, what is some common grounds with other economies in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I hand over right away the floor to Balázs Reiser, who will actually comment on the survey and give his perspective on the findings and maybe sort of on the points we missed or the points we also need to look at. So Balázs, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. First of all, I think it was a really great work and an interesting read and nice presentations. And I agree almost every point. So basically, I would like to add some additional things to the presentation. And these are related to the taxation and about the budget spendings. Some notes about the labor allocation and the labor productivity, and I would like to speak a little bit about the environment protection. So in Hungary, the redistribution is a very large, almost around 50% of the GDP, and it is done a really inefficient way, which I think on the long run has a really important effects on the productivity growth. And the tax system seems to me to drive by the political agenda. So the government want to push some kind of political agenda that sometimes it should be really low. Like, for example, the personal income tax, and we have a 9% corporate income tax. But if you in practice, this 9 percentage point is effectively only 4% approximately. And on the other hand, some other taxes are really huge. We have the largest VAT, I guess, in the whole world, 70 percentage point. And as Martin said also, there are many exemptions and additional taxes, which, for example, affects communication and retail sector, banking, and so on. But there are a lot of other things as well. For example, specific producers try to lobby for a lower VAT tax, so it has gradually decreased. It was started with pork production, after the chicken and fishes, books, and whatever. And the restaurants have 3 different VAT taxes, and even the restaurants and accountants, I'm not sure themselves how to make these how to fight VAT taxes. And on the long run, it has a really huge problematic effects, and it's the problem is much larger than just this industry-specific task that Martin also mentioned. The second related problem is that the governmental consumption is very high. The central government, the size of the central government is booming. It's growing very high, and the budget and the government spend a huge budget on the state PR. I guess at least €500 million yearly. If you add that everything, and it's a huge amount of money which could be spent on other things as well. And the other related, for example, is the sports subsidies, which is the highest in the EU, and I also guess in the world. And these things could be spent on other projects which could boost the productivity growth on the longer run. And if you look for the spending in more detail, then it turns out that it's not transparent at all. We do not know how much money was spent actually on COVID relief, because a lot of spending was put together in a huge bucket, and we cannot be sure what was directly related to helping people and firms, and what was other and totally unrelated projects like building additional football stadiums. And if you look at it's related to the public procurement problems, but Martin also said that these largest expenditure items are not public. So we don't know how the new nuclear power plant will be financed. This is the PAX-2 project, and why we spend so much money on the Belgrade-Budapest rail line, which is already there, instead of this local infrastructure, which is much more needed. And instead of this project, these huge untransparent projects, we should focus much more on small case projects. For example, as Martin also said, the Hungarian economy is a dual. There are large multinational foreign-owned firms which exporting a lot, and small and medium-sized companies are quite separated. And one reason is that, for example, they lack this ICT investment which they need. And instead of these really huge governmental spending, much more should spend on these spillover effects to help the Hungarian small and medium-sized firms to become a supplier of multinational companies, and also some other state infrastructure should be financed more, most especially education and healthcare system, because it's not functioning well, and on the long run it will also decrease our productivity growth. So let's turn to the labor allocation. On the one hand, it's not so small as usually people think, and the reason is because people usually do not change their address if they move from one part of the country to the other part. For example, here is a city called Sopron, which officially has approximately 16 or 18,000 people. But when there was a local election 2 years ago, then it was an important part of the campaign that they try to find out how many people are actually living there, because they guess that it's more than 100,000 people, but the people simply did not change their address. So yes, it is a problem that many people are living in areas in eastern country, in the eastern part of the country, where it's really hard to find a job. But actually, less people are living there than the actual registers suggest. On the other hand, and I was really happy when Martin mentioned it, that the support of local commuting should be improved a lot. On this figure, I showed the NUTS for micro-region level vacancy rate, and darker it is, there are more vacancies. And if you can see, for example, in eastern Hungary, northeast Hungary, then there are huge differences within a county, and it's approximately 80 kilometer. It's a circle with 80 kilometer radius. So people could commute on the daily level if they could get additional support for it. And there are many qualitative studies in Hungary asking people why they do not find a job. And people usually mention it that because they are living in a small village, no workplace there, and they cannot afford commuting to the center of the country. And when you ask people, then they say that it's much more important than the salary level itself. The second issue related to labor allocation is the average quality level of workforce. In the last 10 years, the government decreased the subsidies for unemployed at all, and the economy growth very fast, like in everywhere in Europe. And as a result, the employment level increased a lot, much more than the quality of the workforce itself. And now I think that not the amount of people is binding, but their average training level. And educational system does not help at all, because the tracking is very early. The segregation is very large. I think Hungary and Albania is the only countries in Europe where the education system actually increases the differences between kids compared to their differences of their parents. And the second related issue is that people usually talk about the failures of vocational training, but the problem is that not the number of vocational people with vocational training, but the number of people with the college. And you can see it if you look at the college wage premium, which is one of the largest in Europe. It's more than 70%. And if you turn to the vocational training itself, then it, as Martin also said, that it's a huge problem, and that people do not work in their jobs that they are trained for, but instead they work as machine operators. And I think that, and most of the labor economists in Hungary thinks that it's not that the trainee program, the lack of trainee programs is the real big deal, but instead the quality of the general education. And there are some measurement of reading and writing skill of kids who live at the school, and it turned out that approximately 1/4 of them are functionally illiterate. And you cannot do craft works if you cannot read and write properly, because you have to read the manuals and comply with them. And if you ask people what kind of problems they have with these VET graduates, then they said that they have these they lack of these very basic and simple skills. And I totally agree that the German VET training works better in very a lot of aspects, and the government tries to use this as a benchmark. But actually, the Hungarian training does not use them as it's not similar at all. And the most important problem here again is that the general training hours are much lower in Hungary. So these kids cannot, a lot of them cannot read and write properly. And if you do not fix them, then I would not think that these training programs themselves could solve the problem. And last thing that I would like to talk about is the environment strategy of Hungary, which I think we have something because we have to provide it for the EU, but nobody cares with it much. And I think it's important because I'm very worried about global warming and environment pollution. But beyond this, I think the Hungarian economy has a huge potential, growth potential in this area. And even with these current fundings, the economy could boost it with more specific spendings. For example, in Hungary, it is impossible to build wind turbines. I do not know why, but even though it does not need additional state funds, you cannot build them. And we also should close down the Matra power plant. We should have closed down 10 years ago, or at least modernize it, because it's fueled with lignite and it's very environment polluting and very expensive to maintain. Basically, that's the problem. We spend a lot of money on solar energy and on Matra power plant, and these again could be used more efficiently. And perhaps not the most important point, but this money should spend, for example, the thermal insulation of houses. And because it is important, because a larger of Hungarian population lives in houses built 50 or 40 years ago, and they are not insulated at all. And if you could spend it, you could decrease carbon dioxide emission. It's a very important anti-poverty tool, because very poor people are living in it, and they spend a lot on heating their houses. And also it would boost the economy significantly, because it needs a lot of manual work to do that. And it was just an example, but there could be put it there some others, like for example improving the water uses of the country, and some other as well, which again could make a lot of new jobs, increase the output of the agriculture, and improve the quality of life for a lot of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Balázs. It's very interesting that you added a few additional points, or quite a few additional points, to the presentation from Martin. I mean, the tax system, the green revolution, just to mention the two. I think we will also have to look at the demographic change. But before we do this, I would like to invite Zuzana to present her perspective on mostly on Slovakia. And then I think we could start the discussion, which would not only focus on Hungary. I think the points were already very interesting, but look at the region at a larger scale. So Zuzana, please, if you would like to share your screens.
Can you see my slides now? I will just put them on full screen. Okay.
That looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Well, so thank you once again for having me here today. It's really a pleasure. I had the chance to read the full report, and I really do think it uncovers the key challenges related to Hungary very well. And so once again, very good job on this. And thank you for providing this high quality analytical work. So having had the chance to work on the Slovak National Productivity Board's annual reports in the past myself, I would now like to take a few minutes of your time to really highlight that these conclusions and policy recommendations highlighted by Martin, but also by Balázs, are relevant not only in Hungary, but extend to the region at large. So really improving productivity in Central and Eastern European countries, which is the topic of today's webinar. I would like to show through the case of Slovakia that this is indeed the case. So I would first like to just raise some general issues and findings coming from the annual report on productivity and competitiveness that I had the chance to collaborate with my former colleagues at the Slovak government office and bring in also maybe some implications of the pandemic before just giving a few comments to and discussion points with regards to the Hungarian Economic Survey. So, of course, as was already mentioned, this dual track economy that has been created by the presence of multinational enterprises and other low productive domestic firms is very much the case also in Slovakia. So in the absence of major contributions from structural shifts in productivity growth within sector growth will of course be very important in facilitating a productivity convergence. And in order to do so, the highly productive firms already present in the Slovak economy have to be better leveraged. So as we can see in this slide, the productivity gap between the most and the least productive firms in Slovakia is considerable, with the bottom decile and the productivity frontier firms, the difference in the manufacturing sector being almost 50 times. And we can also see that in the chart to the right, that much of the value added that is generated by the Slovak economy is very much concentrated in only a handful of players. So for example, in the manufacturing sector, the top 8 firms in individual sectors on average contribute almost 90% of the value added. So going forward, really facilitating the diffusion of productivity and facilitating spillover effects between frontier and laggard firms will be very much necessary. At the same time, dynamism of the business environment is of course a key picture in terms of productivity growth and has been showing signs of deterioration over the past decade in Slovakia, as well as was highlighted with Hungary. So here we can see that the share of young firms has over time been deteriorating in Slovakia, and that holds true also in the manufacturing sector as well as in the services sector. So this may not only be hindering an important source of innovation through new firms, but also potentially holding up allocative efficiency and entrenching labor and capital in firms that potentially should have exited some time ago. And so, of course, the pandemic may possibly also contribute to a deterioration furthermore, as we have seen around many European countries, a decline in bankruptcies in 2020. And so it remains to be seen as state support is gradually lifted, whether the discussions regarding the creation of zombie firms will materialize or not, further impeding the business environment. So, of course, in order to restore the business dynamism, as was mentioned in the report, restoring a streamlining insolvency regimes and supporting the competition authorities is very much relevant also for Slovakia. At the same time, demographic trends are very much a problem that go beyond Hungary and relate to Slovakia as well. So these demographic changes and the shrinking of the working population over time do limit the capacity of increasing economic growth through higher employment rates. So really tapping into previously neglected sources of labor will be important. So on the one hand, of course, as the report highlights, this relates to releasing labor potential from previously neglected sources such as youth, elderly, et cetera. But on the other hand, of course, facilitating better mobility of the labor force to address the imbalances present in the country is very much important. So in Slovakia, we can see that, as was shown in Hungary, there is a rather large imbalance in the labor market. So the eastern part of the Slovakia, as one can see with the red part of the map on the left, experiences above average unemployment rates, whereas the eastern part of the country is suffering generally from, or the western part, sorry, is generally suffering from labor shortages. And when we look at the map on the right, we see that this very much mirrors the infrastructure network and the highway network present in the country. So the parts of the country that have low unemployment and high share of manufacturing employment, which is the darker color on the map on the right, is the only area that boasts a highway network. So facilitating mobility and infrastructure development combined with, of course, housing policy reforms that enhance the accessibility are needed going forward. Of course, innovation is a key part of productivity growth, and as is generally known, it remains to be largely underfunded in much of Eastern Europe, and especially the case in Slovakia. So as we can see, the low R&D expenditures in Slovakia, not only per inhabitant, but as a portion of GDP, is very behind much of EU CEE countries as well. And it relates to also the fact that we have very limited venture capital financing, as well as just a general lack of availability of local investment funds, which would stimulate innovation. And of course, commercialization of the innovation is also problematic, as we can see that the number of patent applications is very, very low and behind much of the EU CEE again as well. So here, incentivizing more efficient collaborations between academia and the private sector, and allowing perhaps university research parks to lease out their premises and their facilities for joint research activities, as well as allowing them to acquire legal personas that would allow them to have to own patents, would be positive steps forward in terms of facilitating a more dynamic innovation environment in the country. So just briefly touching upon how the COVID-19 pandemic plays into this. As is the case, of course, in most crises, the distributional impacts are of particular concern. So in the pandemic too, as I highlighted that the eastern part of the country is the more vulnerable one, or the less developed one, we can see here that, again, the eastern part of the country was more impacted by the pandemic in terms of the rise in unemployment rates. So that is one aspect. And of course, another one is schooling. So children were coming from marginalized Roma communities, where Roma is this language spoken at home. We can see that there is a huge gap between ICT availability in these households versus general households. So with Slovakia already having very high dropout rates in the schooling, which is almost double the EU average, what is also of concern is that these children could potentially drop out from the school system to begin with, and gaining and getting them back into the system is a very, very difficult task. Now, as Balázs also mentioned, that the green transition may be a good opportunity for growth for Hungary, I do agree, and I think it is very much the case also in Slovakia. So these megatrends that have been accelerated by the pandemic can present a springboard for development latecomers. But of course, as we can see from the assessment of the World Economic Forum, the general sentiment seems to be that the EU CEE countries are not very well prepared for the changes that are ahead. So, however, on the other hand, if this preparedness can be addressed, the lower barriers to entry present in the new sectors emerging, for instance, in the green transition, can present both that these development latecomers can take, and at the same time, much of the automation and the digital transformation can address the labor shortages present in the area. And so finally, just a few points with regards to the Hungarian Economic Survey that I had the pleasure to read. Again, I do think it was a very, very well done work. Just a few of my thoughts, perhaps. So you do mention in terms of the policies that the duration of employment benefits could be lengthened. And I do think that these are very valid arguments, and I do agree. I only feel that in terms of the policy itself in isolation, of course, it may not bring as much change as as the other policies would. So really combining this policy in terms of duration of of employment benefits, with labor market, with housing availability as well as infrastructure availability can only bring about the changes in terms of achieving greater mobility rather than in isolation. So the second point is the relatively high labor taxes, and Balázs did provide a useful analysis of the distortive effect of taxes that is present in the country, and I do think that is also very much true. I'm just to add a theoretical observation to the discussion, I feel higher labor taxes could potentially also, on the other hand, not only deter labor market participants, but it can serve as an incentive to automate low productivity jobs. So higher tax on labor than capital could purely theoretically also be productivity enhancing and also mitigate the labor shortages that are present, which tend to be concentrated in the lower value added segments of the market. And finally, revisions in the retirement age, which will be with the aging population very, very relevant. So the report highlights the relevance of linking the retirement of the retirement age to life expectancy. Here, just some of my thoughts. I think perhaps maybe linking it to healthy life years rather than retirement age might also be a worthwhile consideration, given that it might provide more decent pension conditions, as the gains in healthy life years over the past decade have not been as pronounced as those in life expectancy, also partially related to the deficiencies of the healthcare system. But other than that, that's all on my side, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Yes, so let's open the discussion. I already mentioned that you could use the chat for your questions, and we will see if we have the time to give you the floor directly, or I will read out the questions. But I would like to start maybe going back to Martin, given the two comments, the two presentations you received. If you're looking back at the survey, do you think sort of that's from the recommendations, is it balanced, or do you think something has been missed out, something has to be sort of added? I was looking at, on the one hand, we have the dual economy, which is more like a company-based issue. Then we have the all labor market issue, where we have the demographic changes, we have the long-term challenge of education, and more the short-term challenges of labor mobility. So what are you making of these comments and remarks?
I think I saw a lot of common issues identified, like low labor mobility, demographic change. Something that maybe is not reflected so much in our survey, which I think was interesting, was the comments of more effective government spending. A lot of government spending is not very effective, and this could be used. So more or less like the perspective on government spending, not so much on the policies itself. I think this was very interesting. Balázs mentioned that, and he also brought some very, very nice figures. For example, the one spending on sport, right? Government spending on sports. So there's definitely some room, and I think this is very informative for our survey. But in general, I think there are common issues. We saw it in Slovakia, we saw it in Hungary. It's housing policies, infrastructure, local infrastructure, high commuting costs, and in general, high labor taxes that discourage employment growth. And another issue was the retirement age, which I haven't really addressed during in my presentation, but I think but the survey discusses it, and there's also the latest survey that talks about pension costs.
Thank you. Maybe just expanding a little bit on the labor market side. If you look at the situation from a sort of a Western European or a German perspective, I mean, you always look at the retirement age. That's one thing. I mean, we have a publication today, which is also mentioning this as well. We look at female labor market participation. That's something that hasn't come up here. Maybe you should, maybe traditionally the participation is higher than in Germany or Western European countries. And the third element, which I didn't find, and maybe whoever wants to comment on this, is migration. I mean, we have a lot of migration, temporary migration also in Central and Eastern Europe. It's not the kind of migration we have in Western Europe, but there is migration, and there's outbound and inbound migration. So maybe you could also expand a little bit on those issues. So female labor participation and the question of migration, whether this could also have a potential in boosting productivity in the region.
I will just say some 2 words and then pass over to others. I think I'm speaking too much. Labor force participation of women in Hungary was an issue. It is high, but there is an issue of an increasing wage gap in a certain age of women. That's the age when many women get children, and this is when they start working part-time, and we see an increasing wage gap. And we also discovered that the crash system, the kindergarten system, is not very helpful in combining work and life in Hungary. So we provide some recommendations in this regard. And yeah, it's true about immigration. We haven't really touched up on this topic in the Hungary survey, but maybe others have can say something on that.
Who wants to go next? Balázs, maybe.
Yeah, I would like to add two first thing. First is what I mentioned. I think it's a really huge problem that the tax system is too much part of the political agenda. So, for example, right now it's a very important political issue whether the minimum wage should be increased up to 200,000 forints, because it's a nice round number. It's a 20% increase, while nobody is talking about the fact that because of the flat tax system, Hungary has the largest tax wedge on the minimum wage on the earth. It's approximately 40%. And this should be decreased instead of just talking about the level of the minimum wage itself. And the second issue is related to the labor supply of women. I think that it's a very important political issue that people want to keep these 3 years long maternity leave payments. And I would not recommend to anybody to decrease it, because everybody would be really upset. The government would lose a lot of popularity, and also the number of children would fall dramatically at the same time. There was some kind of a rise on this in '95, and when a lot of other subsidies was decreased, the inflation was increased a lot just to rebalance the budget and to not to go to bankrupt. And everybody cared with these maternity payments, even after 15 or 20 years later. And instead of that, what we should then, and also Martin said it, that there are not enough nursery schools and kindergartens. So if you want to boost the labor supply of women, then you have to build much more of these, and you should support paternity leave instead. And financially help people, help others to stay at home, and help women to work while having young kids. And last point is that the gender wage gap in Hungary is mostly driven by overtime hours. So women are doing much work, much less overtime, and that's why they earning basically less. But if you look at the hourly wages, then the difference would be much smaller. And I guess it is again caused by kids, because women pick up the kids afternoon at the kindergarten or at school, and they cannot work more overtime. And it's really hard to change this. but perhaps some kind of policies to convince fathers that they should also go to the kindergartens would help. I have no other idea how this could solve. How this could be solved. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Isabel was next. Would you like to?
Yes,
Yes.
I wanted to respond to your question or to your comment on migration.
Yeah.
You're right. There's a lot of migration going on, both inward and outward migration, and I think it's a very important consideration that actually policymakers in these countries take into account. What's very important, of course, in thinking about it, is that the skills level is not the same in terms of immigrants and immigrants, and obviously many of these countries are still suffering a bit from the immigration of high skilled workers or young workers, that are not even workers because they go studying abroad and they don't come back. So engaging with the diaspora is very important for these governments, and many of them are very active, in these fronts through various policy settings, from offering, support for their studies, but then, combining this with obligations to work for a few years back in the home country, towards indirect measures in terms of housing policies and so on to make it attractive, for families to come back. And I think there's a lot of, experimenting going on in these countries, and also a lot of, potential to learn from each other, of what works and what does not work. It's very difficult actually to attract these people back. Even though during the recent crisis, we have seen, at least to some extent, some backward migration. There's on one point that Balázs just raised in terms of childcare. What I think personally, what is very important for these countries is also to increase the choice of different forms, of childcare, especially at the very young ages, to cater to the various needs of the various families, and to provide a flexible menu of different childcare options. Because it's not all about credits, it's not all about kindergarten, because obviously, work hours, are what they are, and not all forms are catered towards, to the needs of families.
Thank you, Isabel. Susanna, do you also want to intervene on the question of migration and female labor participation?
Yeah, sure. I can just add very briefly. I think the main parts were already quite highlighted by the other panelists. I think in terms of the female participation, again, the pandemic has exacerbated this, as women were generally tasked with not only carrying out their activities from work from home, but at the same time becoming teachers. And in this regard, the career progression opportunities of women who have been all over 1 year also acting as caretakers and children and the teachers of children can also have some deteriorating impact. So that's one part. And in terms of migration, adding on to Isabel's point regarding the type of workers that are coming in are not matched by the types that are going out. I think what's particularly problematic in Slovakia is also that we don't have many international students, whereas our students are leaving to other countries, particularly to Czechia. So not only promoting migration in terms of labor force, but also students is very important.
Okay, thank you. I also have another hand up from Jens, a colleague of Martin on the Hungary desk. So Jens, you also want to follow up on this issue of on the labor market? You have to, maybe I have to unmute you, so maybe.
I'm trying to. Yeah,
now it's working. Now it's working. Yes.
Thank you very much. Just a few comments on a few reflections of what have been said today. The first thing is that when you look at a graph over the size of the government relative to GDP per capita across OECD countries, then the public sector in Hungary is quite large. It's a phenomenon it shares with other Eastern European countries. But it seems that still 30 years later, they still have not managed to get the public sector into a size that corresponds with their income levels. So there's a lot of talk about the tax levels and stuff like that. But in reality, I think the first thing that had to be done is that you have to rethink what the public sector should spend money on, because in a way, a big public sector is a sign of a rich country. And many of these Eastern European countries are relatively poor. So Therefore, they have to a larger sector, public sector. The second thing, what Susanna was talking about, healthy lives. Particularly, if you want to raise the retirement age, there's a need for healthy lives, so people can actually continue to work longer. It's an issue that we had raised in the previous survey, and the health sector in Hungary is not fabulous. It's subject to a lot of criticism, both inside Hungary, but also outside Hungary. And again, we come back to this, how to make Hungary competitive, because if you have a good doctor's degree, then there's very good job opportunities outside Hungary. And then that adds to the low number of doctors per capita, as we can observe. There's also lifestyle factors. Obesity is an issue, alcohol consumption is also another issue. So there's lifestyle factors that can be worked on, and that's less costly than to build a health sector. My take on the female labor participation is that a lot of these issues that have been raised by others actually turns up relatively late in female careers. Is that when they try to make, so if you look at the wage differentials, they're low until you start to look at career jobs. There, it seems that the women have a hard time to get on to the career ladder, which of course comes back to all the issues we talked about before. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. We have a lot of questions here in the chat regarding sort of the other part, which we were not really discussing in detail, but which were also touched on in the presentation, is the dual economy between the foreign firms and the domestic firms. I mean, we are close to the end of the discussion. We also still wanted to have more of the informal debate. So my suggestion would be that we use sort of this topic to move into the breakout sessions. Maybe one of you, or maybe the three panelists, one of you might want to sort of volunteer to look more deeply into this. And I would recommend that those who have those questions would join either Martin Balázs or Zuzana for the breakout sessions for this, to discuss this further. So before I close this plenary, maybe sort of a quick word on what the three of you want to discuss in the breakout sessions. Really, really brief, because we don't have much time left. Martin, maybe you want to start sort of one topic you want to discuss further, although you want to take away from the chat, if that's fine with you. I mean, as I said, the dual economy is certainly one which is pressing, which we haven't really discussed. So maybe that would be one you could look into.
I can talk about the dual economy, or we can discuss the dual economy.
Balázs, would you also pick one topic you want to expand on in the breakout sessions? A short breakout session, really 5 to 10 minutes.
I don't know, but what should I pick?
Yeah.
I don't.
Or maybe expanding one topic we could set is more the tax system, which was also a question. So maybe that's one you could look into. And Zuzana, maybe you want to look into, as a suggestion, looking at the more regional aspects. So what countries have in common. So there are three topics we set, and then there's also for you to move on the discussion. So what you would like to do is we will assign now the three panelists to the breakout rooms, and you can choose at the bottom of the screen. There is a button breakout room where you can choose in a second the one you want to join, and we look forward to having you in the different rooms and continue the discussions on a more sort of informal basis. And it leaves me to close this plenary session. Thank you all for the participation already now, for our panelists, Isabel for the introduction, and I also hope that you all enjoyed the presentations and the short discussion we had so far, and you will also enjoy the more informal discussion in the rooms later on. So bye-bye from my side, and see you in the breakout session.